Good afternoon, everybody. I'm New York State Attorney General Barbara Underwood. Thank you for coming here today for this important announcement in our fight to protect New Yorkers from fraud. With me are the people who've been leading today's case: Executive Deputy Attorney General for Criminal Justice, Executive Deputy Attorney General for Criminal Justice Margaret Garnett, Executive Deputy Attorney General for Economic Justice Manisha Sheth, Criminal Enforcement and Financial Crimes Bureau Chief Stephanie Swenton, together with Deputy Chief Joseph Dorigo, Assistant Attorneys General Maureen Grodidier, Kristen Bettetto, and Kenneth Heim, and Lead Investigator Brian Metz, that's the criminal side, and Investor Protection Bureau Chief Catherine Milgram, together with Senior Enforcement Counsel Steve Glassman and Assistant Attorney General Tanya Trott. I'm here today to announce a 99-count indictment against Dean Mustaphalli, an unscrupulous investment advisor who allegedly looted and squandered nearly $11 million from hardworking New York seniors. We allege that Mr. Mustaphalli concealed from his elderly clients that he was transferring their nest eggs out of low-risk conservative accounts and into his high-risk hedge fund. To commit this fraud, he allegedly forged his clients' signatures and used fake email accounts in his clients' names. Today's charges include 21 counts of securities fraud under the Martin Act, 18 counts of grand larceny in the second degree and a single count of grand larceny in the third degree, 12 counts of forgery in the second degree, 23 counts of criminal possession of a forged instrument in the second degree, 22 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree, and 2 counts of scheme to defraud in the first degree. The charges today are the latest development in a years-long investigation into Mr. Mustaphalli's shady business practices. In June of 2017, our office filed a civil suit against Mr. Mustaphalli following an investigation by our Investor Protection Bureau. While that suit was pending, the Investor Protection Bureau referred the case to our Criminal Enforcement and Financial Crimes Bureau, leading to the indictment we're announcing today. The story of this scam began at a neighborhood bank branch in Jamaica, Queens. That is where Mr. Mustaphalli worked as a financial advisor, helping customers figure out how to make a little extra money by investing their savings. Many of his clients were older people who had worked hard all their lives. Some were getting ready to retire, some had already retired. They were nurses, shopkeepers, homemakers, municipal workers. They had played by the rules, putting away a few dollars here and there to make sure they'd have enough for a relatively comfortable retirement. They were not big-time investors. They had nest eggs in the bank for savings and retirement, and they had asked Mr. Mustaphalli to invest their money in safe, secure investments to generate a modest income on their savings. They liked Mr. Mustaphalli, and they trusted him. So when he told them he was leaving the neighborhood bank and starting his own investment firm, many of these hardworking New Yorkers followed him. But that is where the trouble allegedly began. As we allege, Mr. Mustaphalli soon began moving his clients' money out of their safe, low-risk investment portfolios and into much higher risk, higher leveraged investments, specifically a hedge fund that Mr. Mustaphalli himself had created. As we allege in our indictment, he misled the investors to believe that he would continue to invest their money in safe, low-risk portfolios, whereas in fact he transferred the money to his own hedge fund without their knowledge or consent. The switch made no sense for these small-dollar conservative investors. By and large, they had low risk tolerances, small net worth, and simply wanted a little bit of growth to stretch out their retirement savings. To make these transfers, in some cases, Mr. Mustaphalli allegedly showed his investors only the signature page of the hedge fund agreement and did not explain what it was they were authorizing. Additionally, he allegedly forged investors' initials on a key provision of the agreement, which falsely indicated that they had a net worth of over $1 million, which is a prerequisite for being a suitable investor in a hedge fund. He also allegedly used fake email addresses for investors who in some cases didn't own or know how to operate a computer. These people trusted him, and he took advantage of that trust. By the beginning of 2012, he had moved $7.1 million from dozens of investors into the fund. Then, as we allege in our civil papers, he allegedly began a series of reckless investments. By the end of that year, the initial $7.1 million investment had shrunk to $500,000, a staggering loss of 92% in a single year. By the end of 2014, the fund had basically been completely hollowed out. Less than $200,000 of the initial $7.1 million was left, a 98% loss. But as we allege in our criminal indictment, he didn't stop in the face of these devastating losses. Instead, he doubled down. By May 2015, he brought 22 additional investors into his hedge fund, collecting $5 million in additional investments. Within 6 months, he had lost $4 million of that newly invested $5 million. The criminal charges we announced today concern these investors. All told, dozens of New Yorkers, mostly seniors, invested about $12 million with him and lost $11 million. In the aftermath of these losses, Mr. Mustaphalli allegedly diverted $100,000 of the remaining balance to himself using a series of shell companies. When we filed suit last year, we were able to freeze what was left of Mr. Mustaphalli's assets, and some victims have received a small portion of their money back. But unfortunately, much of the money was squandered by his ill-conceived and unauthorized investment strategies. Our office has been doing everything we can to make sure justice is done and to help these victims as much as possible. It is critical that New Yorkers be able to trust the people they turn to for honest investment advice. The lesson here is clear. If you deceive your investors, you will be held accountable. New York has powerful tools to go after financial schemes like this, particularly the Martin Act, which enabled us to bring some measure of justice to these victims. Our office will continue to crack down on unscrupulous investment advisors. We are committed to protecting New Yorkers from scammers and swindlers. Thank you for joining me here today. Amy Spitalnik will now moderate the Q&A.
Folks can just identify name and outlet. We'll start with non-topic questions. Any questions on this case today?
Hi, Kevin Dugan from the New York Post. Obviously, the criminal charges concerning everything after 2015, does that have to do with statute of limitations?
We brought criminal charges for the most egregious offenses. Those are the charges, those are the situations in which there were the forgeries, the forged signatures, the email accounts, and where there was already considerable evidence that he must have known just how risky this all was. So we focused our criminal efforts on the most egregious incidents.
Hi, I'm Pereira in New York. Is there any chance these victims can get their money back?
Well, they have received a small amount back. They've received about, I think it's 5 cents on the dollar, something like that. 20 cents, sorry. Okay, I've overstated. But the funds have mostly been depleted. So we will seek in the civil case a civil judgment, which will be a debt he will owe, but if there's no money to pay that debt.
Banty, New York 1. I'm sorry if I missed it, but did you mention which bank in Jamaica he was working at?
I didn't mention it. I believe it was Citibank, although he was not at the bank when these fraudulent activities occurred.
Corey Ramey from Wall Street Journal. Can you talk a little bit about his hedge fund and sort of what those investments
I'm going to defer to Catherine, our Investor Protection Bureau Chief, on that.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm
Sure.
Catherine Milgram, Chief of Investor Protection. Mr. Mustaphalli, we allege in both the civil complaint and also in the indictment, engaged in highly speculative and highly levered investments, including sort of layered options bets, including in one allegation in the civil complaint, we allege that Mr. Mustaphalli placed a series of options bets on the volatility of the price of MasterCard stock, losing, I believe, upwards of $2 million on one transaction. So extremely aggressive and highly risky strategies.
Other questions on this case?
Hi, Kevin Weinberger from Bloomberg Law. Did Mr. Mustaphalli leave Citibank on his own, or were there some problems with Citibank that you might have uncovered there?
Mr. Mustaphalli left during the pendency of an investigation at Citi, the allegations of which, or the circumstances of which, are laid out in our civil complaint.
Other on-target questions? Sure.
Tom Blair, Fox 5. What was the average amount of money that these investors invested in with Mr. Mustaphalli?
I don't know the numbers here, yeah.
Stephanie Swenton, Chief of the Criminal Enforcement and Financial Crime Bureau. As set forth in the indictment, the amounts of each of the subscription agreements, which are the subject of forgery and criminal possession of a forged instrument counts, the investments ranged from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but in each instant represented the majority of that investor's savings.
Move to off-topic questions. Thanks, everyone.
Banting, New York 1, how has morale been at the AG's office since Mr. Schneiderman resigned?
I think in the immediate aftermath of hearing the news, everyone was stunned, but we very quickly started looking forward, and I think everybody is really rising to the challenge of advancing the important work of the office, and happy and excited to be able to keep doing it.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, sorry. There. I apologize. I've been following your announcements or candidacy.
Can you state your name and outlet?
Oh, sorry. Mike Smeltz, WCBS Radio. That's what I'm saying on the floor here. I apologize. Is this just temporary for you? Are you definitely not looking to run later on? And I mean, obviously we had the primary, but is this just a temporary post for you, or would you like to continue on and run it at some point? I mean, you'd have to announce pretty soon.
I promised the legislature in my in the interview that I would not run for this in the upcoming election, and I will keep that promise.
Thanks, everyone.